We knew it was going to create an overpopulation, but nobody ever asked us because I think it was more of a political thing that, well, we're going to show them, we're going to get tough on crime. But we often fail to use common sense when we take that approach.
Hey, everybody. Pete Bludworth with Corrections Unfiltered, podcast where corrections meets conversation. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to talk about this particular podcast series we're about to begin. This series is about prison reform. It's not talking about that people should not be put into prison. What it's going to talk about is what can we learn from the laws that were passed in the late 80s and early 90s, and what have the results been and how it's affected corrections today. If we don't honestly take a look at what we have learned, we're never going to be able to correct things for corrections in the future. So that's what this podcast is truly about. It's about leadership, it's about policy, and it's about learning from the results of what took place before. So before we get in this conversation with our guests, please do me a favor. Please hit that like. Please hit that subscribe. Let's go ahead and get this conversation and meet our guest. Well, hey, everybody. Let me take this opportunity to introduce Percy Pitzer. Percy has a storied history in corrections. Not only was he a warden, but he's been influencing corrections for many decades. Percy, thank you for coming to the show today. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Well, I appreciate the ability to be on your show because I think what we're going to talk about is very important issue.
And this is the first episode of a series where we're going to start talking about prison reform, and we're hoping that at the end we have something actionable that people can take and actually work with. So if you don't mind, let me just ask you my first question is, what do you think are the main issues we're encountering today in corrections?
Well, there's a lot of issues, but it boils down to overpopulation, understaff, staff misconduct, homicides being affected in prisons, assaults on staff and inmates, poor staff morale, and staff burnout, I think are some very major issues that we're dealing with across the nation.
There is quite a few conversations going on social media talking about facilities that are understaffed and the efforts that they're making to get staff members to join into the agencies or join the company so they can, bring up that level. So what do you see the social media aspect taking place as far as the staffing and understaffing is?
Well, one issue that I would be very concerned about is number one, we are understaffed. Number two, staff is getting burned out because of the mandatory overtime they're experiencing. But yet you have some correctional people talking negative on social media about their own organization and how terrible the job is. And then in the next minute, they're talking about why can't we hire? And from my experience, correctional officers or staff are your best source of recruitment. But they can't be two-sided on that. They can't say how terrible their job is and expect people to hire on. And I guess if I was in the system, I would probably have stern talks with those people, because if they think their job is that bad, then they should quit. But they shouldn't burn out their own agency.
Why do you think this is occurring? Is it because leadership just isn't recognizing the importance of their line staff?
Well, as a prior warden myself, line staff are the most important aspect of a prison operation. As a warden, I went home every night. I took off weekends and I'd go on vacation. And that facility would still run. And it's because of your line staff, your correctional officers, your medical, your program people. But now those folks are being reassigned to correctional officer positions. But so if it gets any better, it's going to have to take cooperation from your line staff, or it's not going to work. I'm not sure we're placing the importance on line staff as much as we should. We talk a lot about technology, and technology is good. We need it. But that's not going to replace those people on the ground. Some people think it will, but I don't think it ever will. And therefore, you disrupt the relationship between staff and inmates, because inmates are the problem. Then let's work with them and try to make them part of the solution.
Do you see that in corrections there might be an aspect of not admitting that they have problems?
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, you look on social media and everything is positive. Well, everything is not always positive. I think we got to be open. I think we got to recognize what our problems are. Because if you don't recognize your own problems, how are you ever going to fix it? I mean, just be honest with what's happening. We know what's happening, but if we don't admit to it, we don't talk about it, that's a problem that'll never be fixed.
How do you feel that we got in this situation?
I think it was years ago, specifically in 1994 and even the late 80s or during the 80s. We had issues with the Colombian cartel. I was a unit manager in Miami where we got a lot of the cartel people in. But what we did do is we not only got the cartel people, we also got anyone that was remotely associated with them.
Hmm.
And we started locking people up like crazy. And, and we knew it was going to create an overpopulation, but nobody ever asked us because I think it was more of a political thing that, well, we're going to show them, we're going to get tough on crime. But we often fail to use common sense when we take that approach. We lock people up, in my opinion, way too long. And that's not the problems of the prisons necessarily. I mean, prisons can't put a no vacancy sign up. They have to take what they get. And as a result, they become overpopulated. Well, today we're doing a lot with the Mexican cartel. But what we fail to understand is history. Why don't we look what happened in 1994 and compare it today when we deal with these cartels? We lock people up for, in my opinion, way too long of a sentences. And that's creating the situation. And let me give you an example.
Okay.
In our foundation, we provide scholarships to children of incarcerated. And this podcast isn't about that, but it's a perfect example to use. I had a young lady, 18 years old, going into college. She'd been living with her mother, her grandmother, since she was 8 years old, because her mother is doing a 22-year sentence for drug conspiracy. Well, I put some numbers to that, and I believe that's going to cost the taxpayers right around $1 million to incarcerate that lady for the term of her sentence. And where common sense has to come in, is that what we want to do? I mean, I think it's a burden on the taxpayers. I don't think it has anything to do with rehabilitation, and and we got to look at that. And it's all about common sense. Now we're in a situation where the prisons don't have no control over this. Like I said, they have to take what they get. And the courts, do they have any real control with a mandatory minimum sentences and all these stuff? Because they're obliged to follow the law that's in effect. So if this is ever going to change, Congress is going to have to start getting involved and start using common sense. Because, I consider myself a conservative, but with common sense. But on both sides of the aisle, you got the ultra conservatives wanting to lock everybody up, and the ultra liberals want to let everybody go. Why couldn't they reach a point in the middle where it's beneficial to the staff, the inmates, and the taxpayers? But unless we do that, you know, it's not going to change. It's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So, I mean, there has to be some sense. Not everybody in prison's bad. I mean, they made mistakes, and they should be held accountable for the mistakes they made and the crimes that they committed. But when we don't use common sense, then we just go further on down the road and making the same mistakes. Sometimes we got to look at history and learn from history. When I first got into the system as a correctional officer, the punishment of an inmate was a sentence. And the minute that person entered the prison, the goal was rehabilitation. And where is that gone? I mean, it's out the window, and we're not doing it.
So if you took a look at the way things are now compared to when you first started out in corrections before 1994 and before all the big changes took place in the late 80s, what were some of the differences back then that you felt should be looked at as today as maybe something to help give us a guide on how to, go into a different type of pattern as far as sentencing and prison populations and things like that?
Well, to start with, the laws that was made is not accomplishing anything. It's increasing the problems. And, you know, back when I started, there was a common sense approach to crime. And, like I said, the sentence was the punishment. And the minute that person arrived in a facility, rehabilitation was the goal. And I don't even know if we got a strong rehabilitation program. One of the things I failed at when I was a warden was understanding the importance of community education, simply because without that education, communities believe, well, if you send this person to prison, you got rid of the problem. What they're not thinking about, when they get out of prison, they're going to go back to that same community that they were incarcerated from.
Right.
And now the problem is finding them jobs, finding them places to live. And because they're a former inmate, that's difficult. And it also contributes to a revolving door back to prison. So again, it all boils down to common sense.
So let me ask you, Mr. Pitzer, what do you see as the solutions?
Well, like I previously said, I don't think the system can be fixed. I think, first of all, we got to admit that we have problems. We can't just blame the prisons. We can't just blame the courts because they got guidelines. But we have to, number one, look at history. And number two, speak to Congress about maybe coming up with a more common sense approach, because they're the only ones that can potentially fix this. And I think correctional facilities need to be honest about their situation, because we publicize a lot how great things are going, but things are not going great. And they need to be adjusted and they need to be fixed. And I think the only way that's going to happen is readily admit that we have the problems, readily admit that we're overpopulated and understaffed, and come up with solutions instead of just problems. How are we going to fix it?
Right.
And I think Congress is really the only one that can possibly fix this, because when the federal government went to this system, a lot of your state organizations followed suit, and it became a nationwide problem, not just a federal problem, but a national problem. And until we recognize that, it can't be fixed.
Can I ask you one last question, Mr. Pitzer? And that is, what would you like to see come out of this podcast series?
Well, I think more of a common sense approach towards crime, and this tough on crime versus smart on crime is not working. It has to be reevaluated, and the system needs to be more of a common sense type approach, because what we're doing now is not working, and I don't believe it'll ever work. I think it will even get worse.
Well, that's great insight. I truly do believe that we are on the right course with starting this podcast series. And I appreciate you being the person who launches it and gets it going, because of the number of years that you have seen the cause and effect of laws that are passed and how it goes once it's deployed into the correctional system and then further on into the parole or supervised release system. It's all going to be very important. So I believe that this podcast, this first one, is going to give us a great blueprint on how we can start moving forward. And each of these conversations would be so valuable so that hopefully at the end, we're able to say that we have some kind of an actionable type plan that can be put in place to help mitigate the issues that we're seeing, especially with sentencing, prison reform, reentry possibilities, and the other things that take place. So I do want to thank you for being the first guest on this series. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, sir. I learn a tremendous amount from you when we do that. So thank you again from Corrections Unfiltered.
And thank you. I appreciate it.